To our event today. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Hannah Kabir, who is doing some really terrific work in Nigeria to expand energy access to the marginalized populations. She leads a company called Creed's Energy, and I just heard that over the past 6 years, they've expanded to 7 different states in Nigeria, which I think by the standards of this industry it's an extremely impressive accomplishment. So I'm really looking forward to hearing how all this was possible and what comes next. I also want to thank Paul Lubeck, who is a professor here at Smes, the director of African Studies, and who has 3 decades of experience working in Nigeria, elsewhere in Africa, who has done a lot of terrific work in promoting small businesses, entrepreneurship, as solutions to some of the social problems that Nigeria and other countries face. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hear a few words from Paul to set the stage. Then Hannah is going to give her talk, and then after that we'll open it for a conversation. Right?
Hi, everyone. I'll try to be mercifully brief. It's a really important week in Nigeria. We're having an election, 20 years of democratic rule after 16 years of military rule. And the problems in Nigeria are enormous that Hannah is going to refer to. It now has more quantitative poor people than India. It is undergoing an enormous population explosion, and by the year 2050, it'll be the 3rd largest country in the world, displacing US, and approximately 411 million people. So the demand for energy and electricity is enormous. In the past 10 years, I've started working on, I've given up on the state. Nigeria will cure you of state-centered development. We won't go into that. And I've been looking more at businesses and then looking at employment, because the small, medium-scale industry, unlike India and Southeast Asia, is very underdeveloped. And this is what I love about Hannah's work, in that she's focusing on small, medium-sized industries with providing solar and grids to enable them to participate, to incubate new businesses that will employ this massive youth population that's emerging. Hannah did her first degree in one of the London universities and then at Newcastle, and she's someone who works in the field and is an innovator, being probably the only woman I know in Nigeria that's working and set up her own company, Creed's Energy, to provide off-grid solar to the disenfranchised majority. So it's wonderful to welcome her here. She's going on tour the University of California after being here for a week. She'll have consultation hours in African Studies on the 6th floor after a Wednesday talk from 12:30 to 2, and then in the afternoon she'll be available for people that want to talk with her. So welcome to Hannah. Go up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes and Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a bit about my company today and how we started our journey providing energy access to small businesses and households, but also to give you an insight into Nigeria's power sector and the challenges that we're faced with, and why we think renewables will be the next best option for us. Okay? So a little bit about Creed's Energy. We started about 6 years ago, and basically we created this company to provide energy services and solutions using clean energy technologies. And basically what we are looking to do is to improve energy access across Nigeria. So over the last 6 years, we've been involved in mini-grid assessments across 200 communities in Nigeria. So we've been out in the field studying the sites, profiling the energy demand, and understanding what the needs are in terms of household energy needs, in terms of small businesses, and in terms of productive use of energy. During that period, we've also done solar installations for households, businesses, and communities. Going into 2018, we decided to focus more on the small, medium, and small, medium enterprises, mostly because we see that there is a lot of traction on that side to provide power systems that are reliable, affordable, and also for the productive users to enable them to also work on their businesses and productive activities. So we've installed, as I said earlier on, systems in offices, small businesses, healthcare centers, and also schools. We've been involved in research and assessments in rural communities and off-grid areas in Nigeria. And a bit about the power supply. So the central grid is split into three structures. You have the transmission, the generation, and the distribution. But Nigeria privatized its power sector sometime around 2005. And what this brought was that you have 6 generation companies and about 11 distribution companies, while the transmission company remains government-owned. But we still get a lot of losses. Despite the capacity to generate electricity, the country has about 4 gigawatts of electricity. And when you look at the transmission network, it's also sparse because it doesn't go all around the country. There are some areas that are without grid connectivity, and others that have grid connectivity are also are being underserved because they're not getting much hours of electricity supply. So if you look at Nigeria at night, for instance, you would see very few places where you can see the lights on, mostly in the south, because that's where you have the oil and gas and where the thermal generation is from. So majority of the north, the northwest, and the north central are largely without power supply. In terms of energy access, you have about 93 million people in Nigeria who are off-grid, and about 24 million who are on-grid but are underserved. So they don't get enough electricity from the grid. There's a lot of blackouts and hours, you go days without electricity sometimes. So there's a lot of commitment from the government side of things, where you have targets that have been set to provide electricity, but are not being met because we'll go through the reasons in a bit. So in terms of population, we have a growing population in Nigeria. We're about 186 million at the moment, and projected to grow to about 440 million by 2050. If you compare that to the pre-privatization period, where we were getting about 1.7 gigawatts, and then post the privatization of the assets, we're still at 4 gigawatts. This is for 186 million people, so per capita you're getting about 188 kilowatt hour per year. If you consider that in Washington, for instance, you have about 12,000 kilowatt per hour per capita. So that gives you a comparison to look at there. In terms of the disenfranchised, we've defined them as people who lack access to energy, either underserved, who are on the grid but with unreliable power supply, or those that are unserved, who are off-grid and without any source of power supply. Also, their ability to pay for the electricity. So currently, if they're able to pay for power supply from the grid or using alternative sources such as fuel generators, Nigeria is highly dependent on fuel generators, which are the next best option for a lot of businesses and households. In terms of needs as well, for the categories that fall within tier 3 and 5 of the energy needs, and that is businesses and households that require about 16 hours to 23 hours of electricity. And these are largely businesses and households that use electricity, but also they need systems that are much larger than your Pico solar lights or your phone charging and just lighting solutions. So they need to be systems that can power AC appliances within that range. Our strategy for SMEs is that we're looking at 5 states within Nigeria. There are about 37 million small, medium enterprises across the country, and our focus is in 5 states: Kano, Rivers, Plateau, Abuja, and Niger. So within Abuja, where we're based, we've estimated about 220 million per year in terms of value, based on what the businesses spend on a daily basis for fueling their generators. Now, the advantage for the business in adopting a solar PV system is that they're able to reduce their energy spending by about 50% if you make the systems affordable for them to pay for. So over a period of time, on a lease-to-own basis, for instance, over 2 years, they're able to pay off the cost of the system and own the system, while they save on their energy spend compared to the fuel generators that they already use. These are about 500-watt peak systems, and they provide enough electricity for the businesses within the tier 3 category. In terms of mini-grids, we've supported implementation of mini-grids in about five states in Nigeria, and these were installed basically as solar PV systems, and they're powering communities across the country. So when we look at scaling up electricity, there are options and possibilities that are available for Nigeria. It's either we strengthen the grid, the existing grid, but that also has its costs and the time. When you consider the time it would take to do that, it's going to be longer than what we would spend if we were to do decentralized systems that are, plug and play and use the resources that are available within the communities at any given period. So both the individual solutions and the collective solutions are what we would advocate for. In terms of possibilities, also, we're looking at areas where you have higher population density, but also that the existing grid network cannot service at the moment. And we found that in most places, there are communities that have existed without power supply for over 20 years, even though other parts have grid connections. Sometimes you have infrastructure, and by infrastructure, that means the poles and the distribution lines, but they never get electricity supply. When we compare the costs of these options, either main grid, extending the grid, or putting up a mini grid or a solar home system, you still find that it's cheaper to do the mini grids and the solar home systems. Also, in terms of their reliability, you're able to manage those systems better because they're targeted at particular use. And in terms of their ability to support productive use, which is our key driver, we see that they're more competitive also. So some of the opportunities and challenges that we've highlighted are that one particular one that is important for us is the ease of doing business, because by prioritizing that and then providing an enabling environment for businesses to grow, then we're able to service more of those communities that are disenfranchised and more of those businesses. In terms of collaborative efforts to scale implementation, there are opportunities to collaborate between the government, the private sector, and also academia to come up with solutions that are relevant and are affordable, but also are the right technologies for those communities. Thank you for listening.
A little panel sound will be like this.
Okay.
So I'm going to start by asking you a question on you mentioned the challenges to the business. So what would you say is really the biggest challenge? If there's one thing that's holding you back from expanding and serving more people, what is really the biggest challenge that you're facing in your business?
So for us, I would say it's two things. First, it was access to finance. And once we had a proven technology, it was easier to approach the right institutions and organizations to get commercial financing in terms of consumer financing for the customers, but also to begin to see how we could get enterprise financing for our business to grow. And secondly, I would say it's the skill sets, because that's another huge challenge. We've invested a lot of time and effort in training the staff, in ensuring that we install systems that we can stand by, and that quality and after-sales service is important.
So this is very interesting for me because I've done a lot of work in this sector in India, where both of these challenges are certainly there, but the biggest challenge that you face is that most of the consumers who have a need for, especially for productive uses, are usually already served by the electric grid. The service might not be perfect, but because it's so cheap and often heavily subsidized, any kind of mini grid operator would have to compete with this alternative source that is always there. Whereas it sounds that in your case, mostly the grid is either so unreliable that it's basically worthless for these businesses, or it's not there at all. And I think I was very much struck by the number that these businesses pay close to $3 a day for their energy. That's a very large opportunity for your business.
If you consider that in Nigeria, the competition basically is not, or the comparison is basically not between what the grid is providing and solar, for instance. It's in comparison between the diesel generators and what you can provide with solar.
And so Paul, you've been working in Nigeria for a long time. You said that it sort of makes you less optimistic about state-led development. Is there any hope that the Nigerian power system could be fixed in the next 5 to 10 years? Is there anything that could be done to improve that service, or is this a reality that we just have to deal with?
I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't continue to work on Nigeria, having worked in Malaysia and Southeast Asia. The main problem is the failed privatization of the power sector that Hannah went over. And the the problem is the political regime, the regime in power needs to control the rents to maintain the political patronage system, and to do that, they have to avoid privatizing the Nigerian National Oil and Energy Corporation. They control natural gas, and they are able to block privatization and the efficiencies in the system. That's the first problem. The second problem was that they assumed when they passed out the franchises that the profits from privatizing communications would be found in electricity, and they made a whole series of bad partnerships. And so the whole privatization has to be restarted again, and that's where we're waiting. I think that the major force for change is a new generation of enterprise-minded Nigerians that HANA represents, and they are going to be 70% of the population, and they will really drive this change. And everyone is surprised that democracy has lasted as long as it has in Nigeria, given its problem of 350 ethno-national groups. But it has sustained itself, and they have completed probably this week another election, and there's enormous pressure for major structural reform and privatization. So that's why I think there's hope there.
All right, excellent. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Could people identify themselves also? So, yep. There's a microphone?
There's a microphone coming.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm second-year graduate student at Johns Hopkins Science. I'm very interested in all of your opinions on the power sector reform, because you spoke about the partially failed privatization of the power sector, but I think one of the major drivers of the development of mini-grids in Nigeria is the regulatory reform towards setting the tariff for mini-grids. I wonder, how do you think about that in the context of the power sector reform?
Right, so in terms of regulation that is specifically for certain types of technology, I think Nigeria has done well, especially with that of the mini-grid regulation, which came in recently around 2016, I think it was. And that was also the efforts of the Rural Electrification Agency. They're pushing for a lot of development within the renewable energy space for off-grid communities, both with mini-grids and with solar home systems.
So my perspective on this, again, comes mostly from working in India, where there's a few things that are really interesting here. One is that India also tried this privatization model in the 1990s, and it was basically cancelled because of political backlash. This was at the time of the Enron scandal in California, and Enron was actually building power plants in India under this same plan. So that's why they pulled back and went back to their state-owned enterprise model with some corporatization, unbundling, and so on. It didn't work great, but it sounds like it's working better than in Nigeria, so supply quality has improved slowly. One thing that's really interesting, I think, for the renewable energy sector, and especially the distributed sector, is that in some sense, for the sector, the ideal scenario is one where the state does a good job at creating an enabling environment and regulations for the mini-grids, but at the same time doesn't do a very good job with the power sector itself, right? Because the better the power sector does, the more competition there is from the state-led traditional alternative, but at the same time, without the regulations and policies for the mini-grids, it's simply too difficult to do business. So it's a very interesting sweet spot where the mini-grid and decentralized industry can thrive. Paul, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, the comparison with India, I've done work in India, I've traveled in India, and I have supervised dissertations there. It's important to understand that India had a high level of state economic planning till 1991, when that collapsed. and you have the Indian Army for 100 years providing management, and you have the training institutes, the Indian Institute of Technology that's produced technicians. All of that is missing in Nigeria, right? And you have this is the poster child of the resource curse. You have an enormous increase in petrol rents in 73, 74 that destroyed any incentive to work for a living when you could do political connections and quadruple your income. And now, with the stagnation in the oil sector and the increase in population, the per capita value of energy rents is declining, and this will create pressure to move to more market-oriented activity. I am for state involvement, but the Nigerian state has to withdraw to its level of competence, right? And the example of the existing refineries is important. So the Nigerian National Oil Corporation has 4 or 5 major refineries equivalent to roughly 500,000 barrels a day. They're lucky if they operate at 15% capacity, right? It's old technology. And then a whole class of people with opportunities to import refined product have emerged, and they get licenses to do it, and you get the worst possible nightmare. A country with 5 million barrels a day capacity importing all refined products, people getting licenses for it, and then the government was subsidizing the price, so the banks were printing money and rents. That's the level of corruption that's institutionalized. And it's the market that offers the opportunity. And the reason why I'm optimistic about entrepreneurship is I'm also studying the wealthiest man in Africa, Aliko Dangote, who is building a 650,000 barrel a day refinery using Indian technology and American technology that will make Nigeria self-sufficient in exporting product. I think that's the future, and if the state could get it together, which is problematic since for 50 years they've been unable to do it, I think the state will provide regulatory functions. But it's really the private sector that's going to produce the economic transformation that will allow the majority of Nigerians to live dignified lives and have employment.
Hi, I'm Julie. I am a first-year African Studies student here at Smes. So my background is in public health, so I was very interested when you mentioned earlier that your company had installed some grids at health facilities. So I'm not too familiar with Nigeria's health system and how decentralized it is, but I was curious if it's being installed more at like smaller healthcare facilities, like at the community level, or if you're targeting like state level hospitals.
Right, so the installations we did were at primary healthcare centers in a particular state in the southwest, Oyo State. And that basically provided them the power to keep records, also to see patients and, pull up their records. But a very interesting thing that we found was that a lot of these hospitals also did not have refrigeration, for instance, so they couldn't keep vaccines. And when the women came in to give birth, there was no light to do so, so most of the nurses were using their mobile phones and putting the lights on. So perhaps by increasing the size of that solar installation, it would cater to all the other needs within the health centers.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I've worked on social entrepreneurship in the north. If you looked on the map where it's all dark, women are giving birth at night in the dark, right? And a minimum solar panels will allow them to have some kind of medical care that'll reduce an enormously high level of maternal mortality and fistulas and every imaginable problem that occurs in childbirth. That's one thing. The second is I had a project where, with medical records. If they can have power, then it's possible for women, it was on maternal care, to have records so they won't get the same number of shots each time they come into a primary care center. They have no medical records, so they're uncertain what to do, so they keep giving everyone the same amount. Third is there's enormous corruption in the distribution of state drugs, and with electronic medical records, they can actually do it. There's another woman, Amal Hassan, that works on this, that, excuse me, has been to SICE, and she's doing medical records to be able to, so the energy off-grid, it can have an enormous multiplier effect in the healthcare system also.
Okay, we will take one at the back.
Hi, my name is Chris Dolan. I'm a lawyer with DLA Piper. And I had a question about the microgrids. And in terms of the off-takers, are you looking at individual consumers or are they small businesses? And do you do individual metering for the different consumers or small businesses? And what do you have any kind of sense of the credit quality of the off-takers and whether or not you can bundle up a bunch of microgrids together as in a portfolio?
Right. So what we did on the microgrids was provide technical support for the project developers that install those microgrids and the mini grids. In terms of who they're providing the power to, it's both households and productive users, so the small businesses within the community, but also the milling and welding businesses within the community. The other question was?
Credit. Metering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, you mentioned metering, most of the customers have meters, so they pay for the power that they use. On the tariffs, sometimes it varies between the households and the productive users, just so you can have a much balanced energy profile, but also a cost structure to enable, cost recovery on the generation assets.
My understanding is she has different funding for different projects, and the one with Sterling Bank, you should tell them about that one.
Those are the standalone systems.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's a bit different from the mini grids.
Mini grids, yeah.
So here in the front,
Yeah.
please.
I'm Terry Hull with the eMerge Alliance and the Passive House Institute. So my question, have you heard anything about using direct current appliances in these mini grids?
Yes, so some of the customers are encouraged to use energy efficient appliances, and sometimes they come as DC. But in a country like Nigeria, you have people who are very aspirational. So what we found was that by the time you install systems, either the standalone systems or the mini grid systems, people tend to want more. So they buy the bigger TV or the bigger fridge, and these are not necessarily the most efficient appliances, but it's more of a status thing. So even with the diesel generators, for instance, we have a phrase, they're called "I better pass my neighbor." So one person wants to have a system that's better than what his neighbor has, just because he can or she can. So that's the challenge there, but definitely there are system providers that are looking into DC appliances coupled with the solutions that they provide.
What do you expect to get from your trip to the U.S.? What are you really looking for?
For me, I think it's two things. It's partnerships in terms of technology, but also in terms of the transfer of knowledge and how that can impact on business growth within the Nigerian context.
One more. You mentioned the tiers. Are they the World Bank tiers?
Yes, that's the SMAP tiers, yes.
So how are you going to drive the cost of the mini-grid systems down to allow people to afford those higher level tiers?
That is still something that we're understanding because I don't think we have enough data to make a, informed decision on that yet. Most of the mini grids have been installed less than 3 years. The most recent ones even less than a year. So we'll get there with a bit more data.
So I actually have a follow-up question to the question on the financing and portfolio and all that. So how do you actually charge your customers for their power? So if I subscribe to your mini-grid service, do I pay a monthly fee? Do I pay based on consumption? What is the model?
All right, so we don't have a mini-grid installation. We've supported mini-grid installations for other project developers, but they charge per kilowatt hour. So you have, for instance, some charging about 100 naira per kilowatt hour, which is slightly higher than what the grid power is, which is about 23 naira. And but if you compare that to what they're getting with a diesel generator, it's very competitive. In terms of the home systems, what we charge for is a daily fee compared to what they're paying for the diesel generator. So in a week, they're able to pay about $10 and afford the system over a 2-year lease period.
So the payment in the standalone systems, you've calibrated it such that it's competitive compared to the alternative, which is diesel for most, and because of the economics, it also allows them to basically pay back the capital cost of the, so it's a kind of a leasing model.
Yes, that's correct.
And will they own the system in the end?
Yes, they
okay,
get
so
to own
it's
the
a lease to
system.
own system. Okay, very good. Are there other questions from the audience? So I have one more question. So if you look at the challenge of electrifying, let's say, all of Nigeria, again, not necessarily with the grid, but providing some kind of energy access, do you think the numbers that we saw from the cross-boundary analysis by the type, it's a home system versus mini-grid versus grid, do you think that's where it's heading? Does it look like that balance is approximately correct, or?
I think it's realistic in that not everyone would get power supply from the grid. That's a given. But in those areas, there are also options that you could use to provide the basic needs.
I'm asking about this because many of those planning tools used for electrification, they start with some pretty basic fundamentals of population density,
Distance from the grid.
But one big unknown factor, not necessarily unknown, but difficult to predict factor is the power demand, right? So I'm wondering, in your case, when you provide people, enterprises, this energy access, do you see demand growth over time, or is it the case that they subscribe and they keep using the same amount of energy? What's your sense of this dynamic?
I would say it's both. There are some customers who have asked for an upgrade, so they install more panels or add more battery storage. And there are others that maintain their power use once they're a bit used to managing what appliances they use at what time, at certain times.
Very good. This is a really big question because in many areas, both Africa and South Asia, you see that the current baseline demand for electricity is very low, right? So you cannot make, you can maybe provide a home system that provides lighting or fan or TV, but any appliances beyond that are currently not being used. So the question then becomes that if you improve the service by providing a mini grid or something, will demand grow over time? Will it kind of unleash the demand in a sense? So I'm always very interested in this. Should we think of consumers as having some kind of a fixed baseline demand, at least in the short run, or should we say that it's actually quite flexible depending on what's available and what the other opportunities are?
I think it's also to do with educating the users, because that way you're able to manage expectations as to when you get a X size system, it will power a Y. It will give you Y at the end of the day. But if you need more, then you would have to upgrade the system. So it also has to do with a lot of consumer education there.
And what do you do if somebody asks you for more? Suppose that somebody has a home system, they're paying the $10 a week, and then they say, actually I need more. Would you just install another system, or is your system modular? How does this
Right,
work?
so at the moment it would be an additional system that they subscribe to.
I've seen this model in many cases. So it seems that for many businesses in the off-grid area, it's very important to be kind of modular in the sense that the scaling is done in a very regimented way. That if you start customizing for every consumer, as long as they are fairly small consumers paying $10 a week and not $150 a week, it's just not worth the difficulty. You have to have a model that is kind of, almost like not one size fits all, but that the sizes are very well defined and you don't have this very customized model. Because that only works if you have a huge consumer, like a factory.
Definitely.
If a factory comes to you and says, we need a megawatt system, then you'll do whatever they need,
Precisely.
right? But if somebody just needs, a few hundred watts, it's not worth the hassle to tailor whether it's exactly 250 or 240 or 270, right?
Yeah.
Is Paul, anything you want to?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that Hannah will be here this week, and several of you have far greater knowledge than I, where I'm a political economist and regional developer. And the question, the presentation from Hannah is about her collaborating and working on mini grids. So I hope those of you that know more about it could talk to her afterwards, because that's something a group of us are hoping to develop. And what we're going to try to develop is mini grids for institutions that are able to get the startup money to be able to set them up, and also to create business incubators for young Nigerian entrepreneurs. So you have a surplus of university graduates with no possibility for work, but with all kinds of technical skills and degrees. And we think that would be a market that would be able to sustain itself and also to get support from institutions in order to launch them. If any of you have ideas about this or ideas from the World Bank, please share them with Hannah. She'll be here all this week. Okay.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about blockchain and how it might help?
Possibly in terms of the payment side of things and collections. But at the moment, pay-as-you-go software is where we're at in Nigeria. And mobile money is still not even strong enough. So it would be quite a stretch to jump straight to the blockchain.
Yeah. The mobile money, if you compare Kenya and Nigeria, right? So in Kenya, you have really a fascinating integration now between solar power providers and M-Pesa style. But the Central Bank of Nigeria effectively has blocked that. So we're trying to reform the central bank. She's working with a Nigerian entrepreneur, Chika Mordi, you may know him, on the financial things. But that's one of the obstacles that the petro state has institutionalized, where Kenya because it had to be responding to the international markets in a rapid way. It's much more flexible, much better business profile, the cost of doing business. So that's where innovation has occurred. But that's coming back more and more and putting pressure for deregulation in a responsible way in Nigeria.
Right, wonderful. Do we have any final questions? We still have time for one if anybody.
Yeah.
Anything? So as Paul mentioned, Hannah will be here for this week, so I hope everybody will have a chance to
Yeah.
propose any innovative
She's
ideas.
speaking on Wednesday at 12:30 in, I'm not sure, 736 here on youth and employment and other projects she's worked on. So we welcome everyone, and we hope we can continue this initiative to enterprise in Africa. This year we're working on SMEs and solar power. So, thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you.